Hello again! Welcome to my chronic fatigue syndrome recovery story series. This is part 3 of my story so far. So if those of you who haven't seen part 1 and 2 yet, that's a good place to start. Put some links on the screen here and in the video description below if you want to take a look at those. Part 1 and 2 covered my first about 2 years of when I first got sick, when I was at my sickest. So where I'd left off in the last video is that I was starting to get a little bit better, realized that unfortunately my marriage was over. I got divorced. I tried going back to work part-time and that failed spectacularly. I was still just far too sick, unfortunately, so I ended up quitting my job for good because I'd been on a short-term disability leave for quite some time, somewhere around 1.5 to 2 years, and I finally had to accept and face the facts that I just really wasn't up for working. So divorced, quit my job, moved back home with my dad into my childhood home, and still chronically ill. I was coming from a big house. You know, I was in my early 30s. I'd been on my own for a long time. I'm used to having lots of space. My now ex-husband, but then husband and I had moved into this big, beautiful house, which to me was just my dream house. So to give all that up and be back at home, it was tough. It was tough. So despite being incredibly grateful and knowing that I was really fortunate to have some place to go, you know, my dad is wonderful and he took me in, you know, without hesitation, and I'm really grateful for that. But I was really depressed, really deeply depressed. You know, I felt like I had no hope for the future. I didn't know how I was ever going to go back to work again. I didn't know how I was ever going to be in a relationship again. I felt just really low about myself. You know, my self-esteem, I think, was in the toilet. It's just hard to feel good, or I found it hard to feel strong and good and confident when I just felt so helpless. You know, I couldn't work. I was living at home. You know, I just didn't feel like I had a lot of prospects for my life. All the dreams I had for myself and where I wanted to be at that point in my life, none of it was happening. And in fact, I was taking giant leaps backwards, not even backwards, like some whole other horrible direction. And suddenly I was in this place where I was still suffering every day. I was still really limited in what I could do. I still spent most of my time resting. And I just had no life. I really had no life. So you have to picture this. I'm back living at my dad's place. I'm actually in my mom's old room. My mom had a lot of chronic health issues as well for the bulk of her adult life, and she ended up passing away just before I got sick, just within a year before I got chronic fatigue syndrome. And she slept in her own room because, like me, her illness brought on a lot of sleeping problems, so she had to have her own space. And then that room was just empty after she passed away. So when I moved in, I took that room. So it was another layer of just something tough to deal with. Everything just felt depressing. I hated my life. I really did try not to take over my dad's home too much, so I would stay in that bedroom the bulk of my time, and I brought a lawn chair with me that was from the backyard of my old house. It was this long reclining chair that I really loved. It was really comfortable, so I put it at the foot of the bed, and I would just hang out in it during the day. I'd recline with my laptop on my lap and just, I don't know, watch movies, do whatever. And this was my life. So the only thing that I could figure that I had going for me, the only thing that kept me going, was that when my husband and I sold our house. The housing market had boomed, so we were able to make some money on it. So thankfully it paid off. It wiped out all of the debt that we'd accumulated while I was sick, and that was a lot because we spent tens of thousands of dollars on testing and treatments and equipment for our home and all sorts of things just trying to get me well. So it took care of that. And then, I also walked away with a decent chunk of cash in the bank. So I had some money, not tons, but enough that I figured it could be something worth living for. It sounds ridiculous to say now, not the money itself, but I could turn it into something that could bring me some joy. So what got me out of bed every day was getting into that lawn chair, getting on my laptop, and trying to figure out what I could do with that money to find some happiness. And I knew that whatever I did, it couldn't be something small. It couldn't be I needed something big. I needed something drastic. I needed something dramatic to pull me out of these incredible depths that I was in. I just needed to radically change my life. And I'd always loved to travel. So I started thinking, maybe I could go somewhere. Maybe I could go live somewhere else. I knew I was still really sick, but I also had a lot of denial going on, and was just naive about things. I had a sort of attitude like, just get there and then you'll figure it out. Just go somewhere and crawl around on your hands and knees if you have to. Just go. So I started looking at different countries. First I was thinking Hawaii. I was living in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada at the time, so that sounded pretty exotic. But then I thought, no, I need to think bigger or farther. So then I got my heart set on Australia. Australia just sounded so beautiful and so exotic to me and so far away. To me, almost might as well have been on another planet. What a dream to go there. So that was my plan. But then I realized that it was winter there. And even though Australian winters aren't especially cold, I wanted hot. I've always loved the heat. So then I started thinking, well, maybe I could go somewhere near Australia and hang out there for a while and wait until the Australian summer comes, and then I'll go there. So I'm looking at the map. My knowledge of geography at the time was horrendous, just really embarrassing how little I knew about the world. So I'm looking at different countries, and I decided on Thailand. I'm like, Thailand's close enough. I could go to Thailand. It's always hot there, and I could hang out there. And then when it's summer in Australia, I'll fly to Australia. And then I had this plan that from there I was going to go to New Zealand, and then from New Zealand I would go home. So I started doing some research online just to see how much a trip like this would cost, a budget backpacking type of trip. And from what I could tell, I did some math. I looked at how much money was in my bank, and I determined that I thought that I could keep a trip like this going for about 7 months before I'd have to come home. So I did it. I booked a ticket. I just went online and I booked a ticket to Bangkok. And I'd read somewhere that you needed to have a ticket showing that you were going home. I didn't understand any of this at all. I was so out of my depth on this one. I just clueless about the world of backpacking or even just travel. I traveled some, but never like this, and never to this region of the world, ever. I'd never been anywhere in Asia. So I booked a ticket to Bangkok, and then I booked a return ticket home from New Zealand 7 months later. It felt very early midlife crisis, eat, pray, love style. Like I just was catapulting myself into something crazy and wild and new, and just I wanted an adventure. I wanted to find a way to be happy again. And also, if I'm honest, and this is hard to say, but I think we don't talk about these things enough because they're shameful, or we believe that they are shameful, and then the more we don't talk about them, the more other people might feel that it's something shameful. But I didn't want to live a life with chronic illness. I know many people do, and it is admirable, and I wish I could say that I was stronger and I had a better attitude, but I was completely defeated, and I didn't want to live that way. But I thought, I'm not leaving this world with all that money sitting in the bank. So I'm gonna spend it first. And it wasn't so morbid as, and at the end of it, I will take my own life. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't that concrete, but it was just that the idea of spending the money and the traveling gave me a reason to want to keep living, if that makes any sense. And I hoped that in that process, I would discover other reasons to want to keep living. That during these travels, that I would find joy, that I would be happy again, and I wouldn't need money or a trip or something else to keep me going, that through that experience, I would breathe some life back into myself again, and have that fight and that drive to keep going. And the reason that this year of my life is so important, that I've decided to do, of the whole 10 years, to single out this year and do a video just on it, is because in this year I learned 3 things that were absolutely vital for me when it came to understanding chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. I'm excited to tell you about this year. I don't really talk about this year much with people, and it's not for any particular reason other than it never really comes up. Even in my book that I wrote about my experience of living with and recovering from chronic fatigue syndrome, I really only briefly touched on it. But this year changed me. This year was transformative. It was such a wild ride that I don't talk about it because I don't even know how to describe it. I would imagine it would be like trying to break down what an acid trip was like. Maybe that's a bad analogy. Trying to keep this a G-rated show. But it was just the wildest, most insane year of my life. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, and exactly what I needed. I landed in Bangkok in the evening and I was terrified, and it was pitch black outside and I could see the lights of the city sparkling outside the window, and I looked out at that and the bottom of my stomach just fell out, because I'm like, what have I done? I was just really starting to panic, like, what am I doing? I hadn't planned anything. I'm normally an over-the-top, extremely detailed planner, but for whatever reason, this trip I decided not to plan anything. I just wanted it to be about spontaneity and fun and no stress and no obligations, just go. But then I was landing in Bangkok and I don't have a plan, and I have 7 months in front of me, which is what I thought. It actually ended up being more like a year. But my head would have exploded if you would have told me that in that moment when I was on the plane. So it's a good thing I thought it was only 7 months. And I just, like, wow. Wow. But slowly I just figured it out. And I never planned ahead. I stayed in Bangkok for about a week. Lonely Planet was my Bible. Like, I would do everything in there it told me to do, go do the sightseeing and whatnot, check out the different areas. My very first morning in Bangkok, I got on their public train just, to get around the city with no plan. I didn't even know what stop I was going to get off on. I just thought, I'll get on the train and I'll just get off when something looks interesting. Oh, I was so clueless. Such a naive, green little baby backpacker. But I started to figure it out. I started to figure out that you just figure out one day at a time. And what a beautiful thing that is. When in life do we get to do that? And I was by myself. And that is so freeing for anyone who has never traveled by themselves. That feeling of being only responsible to yourself. What do you want to eat? you just go wherever you want to go. What do you want to do that day? That's what you do. You want or need to rest all day? That's what you do. It's not slowing anybody down. It's not holding anybody back. It was a complete experience in selfishness and just all about me, doing what I wanted to do, whatever made me happy. It was just incredible. I fell in love with Southeast Asia really fast. And although Australia was always on my radar, and I did eventually get there, it took me longer than I had originally planned. Because after moving through Thailand for a bit, I'd stay in one spot for a few days, and then if I kind of felt like I was getting a bit bored there, then I'd pick a new spot and just get on a train or a bus. And you can quite often get around the country, for $5, or it's really cheap. Accommodations are really cheap. And I ended up exploring most of Southeast Asia. I backpacked through Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia. I went to Singapore. I even ended up going to India for a while, and then on to Australia. But I never did, sadly, make it to New Zealand, but that is still on the list. I will get to you one day. So I was just hopping around country to country. All the clothes I brought from Canada were completely gone. I had ditched them almost immediately because I didn't know what to pack. And when I arrived, I felt I'd packed the wrong things. I just didn't look cool enough. I needed like the backpacker wardrobe, like the baggy, colorful pants that you buy at the market and tank tops. And I collected bracelets everywhere I went. So, beaded and leather and braided bracelets. So before long, my arm was just covered, and I just kept them on 24 hours a day. It was my backpacker uniform. My backpack was getting kind of worn and tattered from lugging it all over the countryside, and I just loved it. I very quickly stopped wearing makeup. I always had a tan. My hair that had always been straight, all of a sudden had these loose, beachy waves that I didn't even know it was capable of. And even though I showered every day and washed my hair every day, sometimes I'd go a whole week without combing my hair. I just embraced this kind of wild beachy look that I had going on, and I just loved it. I remember at one point I lost my shoes, my only pair of shoes, and I went 3 or 4 days before I even replaced them. I just walked around barefoot. I got some new tattoos. I was unrecognizable from the person who had left Canada. That sad, pale, depressed, kind of stuffy, kind of boring, rigid, control freak, always have to have a plan person was just gone. And I was someone else entirely. And it was magical and the best drug in the world. And to add to all of this, in the backpacking world, at least in the areas that I was backpacking during the time that I was backpacking, you hang out, or at least I hung out mostly with other travelers, other people who are also out backpacking. You find each other, and it's just, you bond over your shared experience of wandering the globe, learn from each other about new places to go. You have a lot in common, so it's just a natural group to gravitate towards. But the people that were out backpacking, the ratio was somewhere around 10-1 for males to females. So there were not a lot of women out backpacking by themselves. So just by nature of being one of the rare women out there, I was insanely popular. All these terrible confidence issues I'd had when I left Canada about being desirable, about ever being able to date again. Oh my, they were gone, just gone. It was really good for me. It was good for me to realize that, people would still be interested in me, and it helped that there was this severe imbalance of men to women, but it was a good time. I needed it. I needed to feel that, being chased, being popular, not popular as in like a high school sense, but just that I still had value, that I still had something to offer in the dating world. And just my confidence in general, because I found that chronic illness stripped away a lot of my self-worth, because so much of who I was wrapped up in my ability to have a career, in my ability to work out, be fit, in my ability to dress nice, to, have lots of friends, to be social, to go out and do things. And I lost a lot of that, so much of my confidence was just really in a bad place. And out traveling the world like this, just me and my backpack, was such a confidence booster. Because I think especially as women, we are not always socialized to feel confident, to think that we can go out and do these things by ourselves. Simple things like drive in a foreign country or, just make our way around by ourselves. I know how sad that sounds, but ladies, it's true. It's changing. For sure it's changing. We have come a long way, but we're still not entirely there. So this trip for me was hugely empowering. It showed me that I could do anything I wanted to, that I was capable of taking care of myself, that I was capable of navigating challenging situations. And traveling by myself also made me push myself outside my comfort zone, because I had to keep making new friends every time I landed someplace new. So I'd have to just push past my insecurities and go talk to the group next to me and just bust into their conversation and introduce myself and see if they might want to be my friend. And I called it being aggressively social, because I just, I was never in the same spot for very long, so I had to get in there fast and make friends so that I wasn't alone all the time. So I just had to get over my fears and my insecurities and just start talking to people. I'm sure people are wondering how I did this while being sick. I'm sure there's people even out there that are thinking, oh, you couldn't have been sick. Trust me, I was. I really was. And one of the beautiful things about being out like this is that without anyone witnessing how much downtime I was taking, how many days I spent in bed resting, it was like it didn't even count. I did take a lot of days to rest. I did spend a lot of time in the little guest houses that I was staying in, and I'd spend a lot of days in bed. I was very careful in choosing my activities, so when I did go out to do some sightseeing, I never signed up for anything that was a full day activity or anything at all physical. So of course no hiking or mountain biking or anything like that. It was just very simple and short activities, going out for a couple hours at a time, and I could pull it off. I could pull it off. And like I'd mentioned in the beginning, there were 3 vital lessons that I learned during that year. The first one was that I just made one small change during this year. It really wasn't anything massive at all, but it completely transformed my experience of this illness. It lessened my daily experience of suffering and increased my ability to live my life with joy. Just one small thing. So in this year of traveling, when I left, I decided that I wasn't going to tell a single soul that I was sick. I wasn't going to mention my illness to anyone. And I did this for a couple of reasons. And one was just that I needed a break. I needed a break from this being all I talked about, all I thought about, and from being the sole defining characteristic of who I was. Raelan, sick person. So I just wasn't going to talk about it. Partly to get a break from talking about it, and also because I find that sometimes it's easier to just pretend like everything's okay than to have to keep explaining to the world over and over and over and trying to get them to understand an illness that can be incredibly challenging to understand. So it was a boundary for me. It was a protective move for me that I don't owe the world an explanation. I don't need them all to understand. It's not important. Not right now. Not in this phase of my life. And the first lesson that I learned was that complaining about my illness and talking about it, especially talking about it excessively, gave it power. these things fueled it. These were not passive behaviors without consequence, at least not for me. They made illness seem worse. It made it more of my identity, more of who I was. It impacted my confidence, the way I felt about myself. Because my first couple of years, it's pretty much all I talked about. I complained all the time, and I was struggling, I was suffering, and I voiced that a lot. So, and breaking out of that was really transformative for me. And it's interesting because even though it didn't actually make me less sick to stop talking about it, it felt like it. When I reduced the space that it got in my mind, it somehow had a reduced ability to impact my experiences. And it certainly impacts my memories. When I look back on that year, I barely even remember being sick, even though I know that I was, because when I don't talk about it, it's not fused with those memories. All I remember are the adventures and the people that I met and the conversations that we had about other things. So I'm certainly not saying that people who are chronically ill should never talk about it, or that you should take a year off from talking about it. That's a bit extreme, probably, for most people. It was what I needed. But I guess I just would invite you to think about the nature and the extent that you do talk about your illness. If you are chronically ill and you do find it something that you talk about a lot, what impact that's having on you, on your life, on your recovery, on your happiness. There's got to be a balance. I think there's got to be a balance, and it's good for us, I think, to have a conscious approach to how we are handling this illness, to the mental space that it gets in our lives, and find a good place that works for us, and also doesn't exhaust our caregivers. Makes sure that it works for them as well, because it's hard for other people as well to just constantly have to hear about how sick we are. It's got to be draining. It's got to be tough. And I know personally, I don't want to be driving valuable people in my life away. The second thing I learned was that I found something that I'd been almost completely overlooking, something that was making me sicker, something that was holding back my recovery, that I didn't even realize that I was not giving enough importance to, that I wasn't putting enough stress on. That I wasn't tackling, that I wasn't working to remedy. And if I had never learned this in this year, I believe I never would have gotten better. The second critically important lesson that I learned during that year was how much stress had been impacting my illness and my recovery rate. And I think most of us know, and we hear and read, that stress is bad for your health. It's hard to heal when you're stressed. And we're like, yes, I know, I get it. But I really didn't get it. I really didn't, because I wasn't putting enough effort into managing that stress. I wasn't putting enough time each and every day into my emotional state as I should have been. Because during that year, my stress almost completely disappeared. I was essentially just on vacation for a year. It was just like a building had been taken off of my shoulders. And that really helped my health. And I did notice, because of course it wasn't an entire year with zero stress. Life just doesn't work that way. For a while, I stayed with someone in Australia just for a short bit. And I found myself getting really quite stressed out while I was there because of the situation that I'd put myself in. And when I left, I noticed that my health had really taken a nosedive. And it was the first time in my life I started to really see the health crashes coming from nothing else but stress. You know, I always was sure that exercise or too much physical activity would cause a massive health crash, or too much mental exertion could cause a health crash. You know, energy outputs, too much junk food or alcohol or all that kind of stuff. Bad, bad, bad. But I really hadn't seen until this trip, when so much stress had been removed and then bits of stress would come back, and how my health would just... So I think had I stayed in Canada in that completely stressed out state, I never would have recovered. I don't know how I would have learned to manage my stress appropriately so that my body wasn't dealing with that every day, and so that I could get better. And the third important lesson from that year is that I found one of the keys that would eventually help me unlock my full recovery, something that I had pretty much 100% not been doing during my first couple of years that I was sick, and something during this third year of travel realized really helped my body to get stronger and to start to overcome this illness. And the third vital thing that I learned during that year was that teeny tiny baby little physical exertions actually accumulated over time and made me stronger. And in the end, if any of you have seen any of my videos on exercise, how I finally was able to start implementing an exercise program with chronic fatigue syndrome, it was incredibly difficult, but I did find a way to do it. I'll put some links here and in the description if you want to check them out. Was just starting small, 1 or 2 minutes with really small things, and then slowly increasing. And that's what backpacking was, because even though I was really careful to not put myself into any situations where I'd have to overexert myself, sometimes something would come up that I hadn't anticipated. Maybe I signed up for a short tour and I end up discovering that there's more walking on it than I realized. So I would just go through it and I would do it. And I tried some different things like scuba diving, and I don't know how I'm gonna do this. But just little pushes on my body, little pushes over time built up strength. But they had to be so incredibly small as to almost not even be noticeable or noteworthy, not anything even really resembling exercise. So those were my vital lessons during that year for my chronic fatigue syndrome recovery journey. So here I am, all alone on the other side of the world with chronic fatigue syndrome, no money, virtually no credit, trying to figure out what to do next. And that is the story for my next video. And spoiler alert, although the adventure definitely continues, there were some harsh realities waiting for me. I had to start facing chronic fatigue syndrome again because I was going to need to find a way to make money and live a bit more of a normal life, which meant that all of those limitations that I'd been avoiding were going to be back. So I thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you found some of this interesting, informative. And as always, if you're curious about the things that ended up working for me to get me well, to help me recover from chronic fatigue syndrome, I'll put some resources and some links in the video description if you want to check that out. And please come find me on Instagram. I'm really quite active there. I'm messaging with people there all over the world, all of the time. I love chatting with all of you. So I'm Raelan.Agle on Instagram, or you can look at Raelan's Adventures if you want to see some of my world travels. That's another Instagram account that I have. So yeah, I'd love to chat with you there. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button and the gray notification bell if you want to know when my next video comes out. And if you haven't yet watched part 1 and part 2, I encourage you to check those out because they are completely different videos, different stage of my life than what I've talked about today. So that's all for today, and I will be putting out the next part of this chronic fatigue syndrome recovery series next week. So I will see you in that video. Take care, everyone.